What I'd like to do tonight is briefly discuss the introductory chapter of the Tisby book. I'll send 3 questions and probably take about 20 minutes in return for a 10-minute discussion. And then I'd like to spend the bulk of the time on critical race theory. Did anyone do any negative critiques of critical race theory?
I found a good definition, but I didn't. It wasn't because they aren't there. I just didn't really have time to look for them.
Okay.
I was happy I came across a definition.
Uh-huh.
When I was looking online, some of, there's, it depends on what you're looking at, so there's as much negative information out there as positive.
There's probably much more negative information than
right.
positive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I scanned it, but I scanned it, but I don't particularly enjoy reading it because
Right.
Yeah.
As an apologist, it's always good to read those things, even though they're often outrageous, offensive, and
but it explains why I hear people say those things.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Right.
what they have read and it's what they've heard, so it must be so. There must be some to it. So yeah, I do. I hear it, and I guess it's when I hear it, I don't think about it as much as when I read it.
Right.
And I realize the audience that it gets.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so I'll assign everyone to 2 breakout rooms. I've pasted the questions in the chat window.
People.
Hi, we're back.
Hello.
We're back, but
Hello.
we didn't finish.
Yeah,
Almost.
yeah. It's a good discussion.
So who would like to start?
You're going to
Well,
say
yeah,
something,
so
Donna,
Mary and I were the other part of that group, and the 3 of us pretty much said the church wanted to maintain the status quo, and therefore doing nothing, actually in some respects, maybe even oppressing in other directions and grabbing more power. It just perpetuated things by not speaking out, but on the opposite side, trying to oppress in their own way to maintain their own male superiority. And then we were also talking about how that grab for power as the second question about Tisby's book, and we saw that church oppression being kind of also perpetuating the racism. I can't remember, Mary, what else did we say about that one?
well, I think we were also talking about how, at least me, I mean, I'm probably one of the oldest people here. I was saying how my father moved us out of Washington, D.C. when I was about 5 because he wanted to vote. So that's why we had to move to the Maryland suburbs. But I have to say, I was only 5, but later years I wondered, because lots of Black people were coming up from the South in those days, moving into DC. And my father may very well have said, you know, I'm not living here with all these Black people or something. I don't know, but I do know there was that kind of talk as I was older, because I had other relatives who were still in the city. So that kind of thing is what I grew up with, sort of, it's there, you can't do anything about it, just don't be bad or not nice to people. And I was telling Donna that I kind of floated along on that little river until my consciousness got raised when the civil rights movement started, you know. I mean, before that, it was just like, it just wasn't on my radar.
Right.
It just was, that's just the way it was, type of thing. And I think that of course encourages the oppression, because it does nothing to relieve it. Anything that doesn't help harms, is my view. Yeah.
Right.
So, you know, there was kind of that, but, you know, and how it will be. He says his book is going to be hard to read. I expect it is. But I'm liking the first chapter.
How about the other group?
In respect to the first question, you know, one of the things we talked about is the fact that as Catholics, we're called to act. We're called to recognize injustice and help those who are oppressed and help to correct that injustice. And so I feel like that really implicates the Catholic Church in that they didn't act throughout this. And for so long, we haven't. We as a group have not spoken out about this injustice. And hopefully with this current and education and increased enlightenment, hopefully that's changing. Yeah, and then we talked about the how the system of oppression based on race and prejudice plus power, how it differs from the definition of racism that a critic of critical race theory might hold, and talked about the fact that people who are critical of critical race theory, sorry.
There are too many criticals.
I know it gets a little confusing,
Right.
but are likely threatened by it, because it's a lot of, in this article I read in the New York Times, it talks about how critics of critical race theory seem to see it as an attack on them, as shaming and accusatory or divisive, and how if this history has allowed them, if it's showing that our history of racism has allowed them to come into positions of power in a way that's not solely based on their own merits, and that's really a personal threat to people.
Yeah, they're threatened.
Yeah.
There's, you know, I took a look at Kimberly Crenshaw's book, Critical Race Theory, which was published in 1996. And one of the articles in it discusses the civil rights laws as encouraging, or encouraging is too strong, failing to counter racism or entrenching racism. With the argument is that you can view racism and racial discrimination from two viewpoints: the viewpoint of the victim, or the viewpoint of the perpetrator. So when you view it from the viewpoint of the perpetrator, which is what the law does, what is outlawed or considered illegal or bad, are fundamentally outrageous acts. So if you accost somebody because they're Black or a person of color, that is discrimination based on the view of the perpetrator committing a bad act. But the problem is that from the viewpoint of the victims, they're enmeshed in a total system which is racist and dehumanizes them.
Right.
And so discouraging perpetrators from being outrageous and crossing sort of arbitrary lines leaves the entire system in place, but only discourages the worst offenders. And unfortunately, even given that, we're now seeing pushback against the limits that define the worst offenders, as racism in our own society has become intensified, as attacks on people of color have become normalized, and especially in this political environment with the growth of Trump and Trumpism, in which the dehumanization of people is seen as being a virtue rather than something over the top. So that notion, deeply embedded in the consciousness of many people, is that racism is fundamentally a problem of attitude, and that I have bad attitudes about people of color or about Black people, but that's only bigotry, and bigotry is not racism. Racism requires institutional power.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting.
So that's what his definition really means: a system of oppression. So it's systemic and not personal. And in our own world, we're in contemporary American culture, we're very sort of and contemporary American Christianity, we're very locked into the idea of the individual, individual salvation, my individual rights. And we tend to miss systemic issues, but we're defined by systems. We're defined by our culture. We're defined by our family. We're defined by our society. We're defined by the systems within which we live.
So with that definition, then a person would or would not be labeled racist.
A person would, if they're acting within the, if their bias
System.
reflects the biases of the predominant system of oppression. But so,
Okay.
for example, a Black person who doesn't like white people is not racist. He's or she is biased. That's a different thing. There's no institutional basis. A Black person who hates Black people is racist. A Black person who, very, very frequently there are gradations based on skin color among people of color. That's racist. That really is based on the racism of the prevailing culture. So to be racist, you have to be a participant in the racism of the prevailing culture. Otherwise, and bigotry is also ugly. It's not to say it's okay, but it's not to be confused with racism.
Right, and does that include indifference?
It includes indifference. Yeah. I mean, this is, there's kind of a lively, there's an issue of where the lines are, an issue of, sort of how much, and an issue of whether indeed non-resistance to evil is evil. I would argue that non-resistance to evil is indeed evil. But, that's been a major area of debate within the history of Christianity. Tolstoy, for example, was an anarchist and a pacifist, and the major critique of him from other Russian Orthodox Christians was that his non-resistance to evil was evil, for example. But so yeah, I would definitely argue that when you fail to stand against sin, then you're guilty of the sin.
Ron, may I interject for a second? This is Eddie. I'm sorry, guys, I'm late. But what you mentioned earlier about playing the victim on race issue kind of caught my attention, because playing the victim somehow gives the other side reasons to say, oh, he's playing the race card again. Oh, he's playing this. Oh, he's playing that thing so he can get into advanced educational system. That's not so much so. As a person of color, I'd like to say that I don't want to play victim. I just want to be a productive member of a society, given a level playing field, given the same opportunity as you, as anybody else, and not be labeled as a victim or or anything else, because in everyday life I am fully aware of where I am. Even riding the bus, I am fully aware where I'm supposed to sit. I am fully aware of when I go inside a room full of other folks besides me. I am fully aware where I stand. So just give me an opportunity to be on a level playing field so I can also be a productive member of the society. I don't want to play victim. I just want to make it clear. I don't want to play a victim of this race issue. Thank you,
Right.
guys.
We can discuss the victim issue, and when we discuss critical race theory further. So are there any other, one of the things that's significant to mention about Tisby's book is that it's a broad overview, so that even though it's really good, it also really only scratches the surface and provides really just a high level overview. So, high level overviews always have significant defects simply by virtue of being high level overviews. So it's important to, sort of be aware of that, to be curious and try to, read further, investigate further. There's plenty of good material to read out there. Is there anything else before we discuss critical race theory? I've pasted the questions into the chat window, and then we'll rejoin and have a group discussion. Welcome back, everyone.
Hello.
So let's go through the questions systematically and summarize the discussion for that point. So what is critical race theory?
I can tell you what it states, if that's what it is, if I could read it. It says the critical race theory states that the United States social institutions, criminal justice system, education, labor, health, housing, so forth, are laced with racism embedded in laws, regulations, rules, and that lead to differential outcomes according to race. Right? It does not. Then it goes on with what it does not. It does not attribute racism to white people as individuals, but every critic of it will tell you that that's what it does because they don't know what it is. It doesn't attribute to groups of people. It's a legal framework taught in law school.
So that's sort of a narrow definition. And
That was from IPJC. Yeah.
it's pointed out that critical race theory is applied in colleges and universities, but not actually in
K-12. Yeah,
right.
I left that out.
But there's a broader sense in which we can look at critical race theory, so here it's predominantly a legal approach to the understanding of race, and especially with to an understanding of how the legal system has to be changed to not be racist. But more broadly, we can also see it as in this sense, it becomes not a new phenomenon, but rather we can see it as an attempt. So, for example, our Tisby is a proponent of critical race theory and has written about it a bit. This book fits well within the context of critical race theory. So in that sense, it's an attempt to, a multidisciplinary attempt to explore racism in American history using the tools of sociology, of history, of economic history, of economics, of law, of politics, of political science, and to unify those in terms of to try to present a cohesive approach to analyze the problem of racism in America. I think that, so the narrower definition somewhat bothers me, and especially the pointing out that it's not taught in K-12, K-12, because the problem is that what is taught in K-12 as history is a gross distortion.
Yes.
And the most, so was trained as a historian. I care about history, very deeply. And what's outrageous is that American history is the most falsified history in human history. And then most people are never exposed to, the falsehood. You can be in some college classes, but most college students don't take American history classes.
Right.
And I was going to have my PhD in history. I never took an American history class. I know of no graduate student in history who I went to school with who ever took an American history class in college and graduate school. It's not something that people did. So we live with these myths that are fundamentally evil and pernicious and racist. They're designed to make us feel good. Some of us feel good about ourselves.
If I could interject in there, when I was taking in grade school and even in high school, whenever the subject of the Civil War came up, and
Right,
these were Catholic schools, there were great pains as the Civil War was not fought because of slavery. It was
Right.
fought for states' rights.
right.
And I swallowed that hook, line, and sinker until I was old enough to say, well, wait a minute, what states' rights? Oh, they wanted to be able to have slaves. That was the
Right, to
right
own
they were
slaves
fighting.
was the right
Right.
they were fighting for.
The the irony in terms of states' rights is that if they didn't have to deploy significant numbers of troops behind the lines, so within the Confederate States themselves, away from battle areas, they could possibly have won the Civil War, but they couldn't do that because they had to keep large numbers of troops station them internally because of the possibility of slave
The
revolts.
rebellion, yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's important to move from this kind of narrow legal framework into a broader one, and also to begin to look at, we tend to look around us and see things as kind of individuals and in individualistic terms. And that really is something that we have to move away from. We really need to look at systems. We really need to look at history. So why don't we move on to the second question? So some of the reasons that critical race theory has been attacked. So one, it's based on Marxist ideology. What is the response to that?
I don't know.
We talked about the level playing field that it would create if there were, if their race, if all people were, in the same, there wasn't a division and people weren't. Does that make sense?
Well, I was, oh,
Well, the question then becomes, how do you level the playing field?
Well, having the theory, the critics of it say it's based on communism. It's a communist ideal. They're threatened by the idea of a level playing field, right? Even if it's nearly impossible to do right at this point, but
Yeah. There are several things, the first is that the label communist, Marxist, socialist has become, it's a label that's used to by anything that particularly right wingers don't like. So in a recent controversy between Marjorie Taylor Greene and one other idiot, either Marjorie Taylor Greene or the other idiot called the other one a communist, which, is ridiculous. So, variously, Biden has been described as a communist, Pelosi as a communist, Chuck Schumer as a communist. So, that's ridiculous. And it's also, said by people who have no idea what a communist, a socialist, or a Marxist is. As a
true,
second point,
true.
assuming that
Okay.
the critical race theory is Marxist, and it's not, but assuming that it is, that's not a very good grounds of critique. So the notion that it should be dismissed because it's Marxist is ridiculous. Then there's also the critique that it itself is racist. How do we respond to that?
I really have no idea about B. C, I think can see examples of it. How white people are afraid of anything that will destabilize the status quo as they see it. There are some white people that their whole identity is the fact that they are white and the Black people are socially below them.
Mhm.
And if the Black people become equal, that their whole identity just melts away. Because that's all they really have going for them is the fact that they're white.
Mhm.
They're undereducated, the lower economic group, a lot of things which a lot of Black people share. But the fact that they are white, and so demonizes white people and makes them feel uncomfortable. I mean, that would be an attack on it by somebody who's afraid of it. Is that the one we were looking at?
Right.
Yeah.
Some of the new legislation actually allows, parents to sue school districts that make their children feel uncomfortable teaching about race.
The governor of Virginia
Yeah.
issued an edict, but here's the interesting part. The edict was to allow parents to complain. I don't know if they can't remember if they just complained to their local school or if they complained to the governor when their children have been made to feel uncomfortable about their background or whatever is portrayed. It never occurred to this guy, apparently, that they're writing and saying, yeah, what they're teaching when they're leaving all the stuff out is making my children very uncomfortable. So he got, you could see he did not expect to hear from Black people. It didn't even enter his mind that a Black person could speak up and say, what you're teaching, the myths and the crap that you're teaching is making my child feel uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
But
Right.
that whole idea where the child's uncomfortable, I agree with you. That's nonsense. You've got to feel uncomfortable to move ahead. If you aren't challenged in any area of your life, then you just stagnate. So you need to feel uncomfortable now and again. But I just laughed to myself when I pointed out that a lot of people writing in to tell the guy that what he's making them do is making their children uncomfortable because they're Black.
Mm-hmm.
I got a very big kick on it.
That is good. Going back to the previous thing about in its critical race theory itself is racist. Remember that racism is bias plus power. Right?
Mhm.
So critical race theory can't be racist because it's not proceeding from a position of power.
That's right. But the Civil Rights Acts and laws did proceed from a position of power, and that's why they could be termed, right? Is that what you mentioned
Oh,
earlier?
the problem with discrimination as defined in the Civil Rights Act from the viewpoint of critical race theory is that it focuses on the activity of the perpetrator and not the activity of the victim. So we end up with a very narrow field of people who commit socially unacceptable acts. But
It's still coming from a
that
position of power.
that leaves the structure of racism intact.
True, true.
So it doesn't affect, racism in banking institutions, racism in the real estate industry, except in really egregious cases.
Right.
Racism in academia, racism everywhere, except in egregious places. There's a phenomenon called white fragility. So when whites are confronted with racism, they tend to react in a variety of ways, with crying, with becoming angry. What are some of the others, Susan? You remember from our discussion?
Well, they react in such a
Glasses.
way that the focus is put on them, right? It's taking the
Right.
focus away from the issue and the people who are actually hurt by these injustices.
Right. For Catholics, it abandons the gospel message of salvation in favor of a program
I never,
of social justice. Has anyone heard that?
no, but not in this particular instance, but for quite a number of years, if you talk about social justice in many quarters, you are labeled as some sort of ultra liberal, probably not good Christian, because you don't want any of the social justice, that's not what the gospel. Those are people who have no idea what the gospel is saying, but they view it as antagonistic to the gospel, when it is the gospel, in my opinion.
Uh-huh.
But I can understand why they would use that, because that's where they're coming from.
It's a sizable number of Christians and even a sizable number of Catholics. The same criticism was levied against Laudato Si, that
Yeah.
Pope Francis had really
Exactly.
overstepped his bounds. He was
Yep.
meddling in an area that he had no business meddling in.
Just because you're Catholic doesn't mean that you really have a good understanding of faith, of salvation, or any of that, because so many of us, any kind of imparting of knowledge stopped when you were about 13 and got confirmed, and that was it. And you have so many Catholics who are so immature in their faith, and it's heartbreaking to me anyway.
Mhm.
Well, for just something that I wanted to share, it's partly, I think, because when we talk about race and racism, let's not limit ourselves to simply just talking about individual racism. We're talking more bigger things here, which I call institutionalized. I think you guys heard about this. Institutionalized racism, wherein
Mhm.
religion is part of it, education is part of it, hospitals are part of it, or the healthcare is part of it. All the institutions that contribute to racism are part of it. That's why when you hear it on the news, when somebody complains in a hospital that you are being a racist, well, it's probably true. Or when you hear someone complains about racism in the educational system, it's probably true. And when you hear
Mhm.
somebody complains about racism in religion, it's probably true, because those are institutions that contributed to race and racism. So I'm sorry, but I'm really passionate about this. That's why I joined you guys.
Mhm.
Well,
Right.
that's what we've been talking about all along. That's what we've been talking about all along here tonight. Those institutions, and where they are, racism is alive and well in them.
racism is
That's what
located
the
in,
critical race theory says it is, says they are.
racism is located in institutions primarily, and through them transmitted into, to people. But so then we're pretty much close to out of time, but the third question is somewhat important. How would an opponent of critical race theory define racism? There are two very different definitions. No one has any idea. They define it as a past problem.
I think so.
Racism is a problem in our past.
Right, yeah.
There was slavery, that's been abolished. We passed the Civil Rights Act. The phrase "I don't have a racist bone in my body" is a very common one, which ignores the fact that bones can't possibly be racist. They're bones. It's people who are racists, and the people who say they don't have a racist bone in their body, or that's not the person who I am.
Right.
That is the person who they are. But the problem here again is that we tend to see. It's really important to move away from seeing racism as the activity of an individual and the outrages of an individual, to move to seeing racism as transmitted by institutions, transmitted by history, transmitted by culture. History forms who we are as people. Our country's culture and history, our family's history. I mean, we like to see ourselves as free agents, but we're really not.
That's right. We're part of a community.
We're constricted more than we're free in many ways.
Yeah. And we can't even either won't or can't see it. And that's what's so scary.
Right. Seeing it is really critical because it allows us to evaluate and change. So there are very many things to be proud of as Americans. There are also very many things to not be proud of.
Right.
If we
try saying that in a dinner table or a cocktail hour conversation.
When we look at those carefully and we repent and we we combat oppression and we speak out on behalf of the oppressed, then we can begin to free ourselves of the dark side of our family tradition, our dark side of our national tradition, dark side of our faith. And that's an important thing to do. Repentance is, coming to a place of repentance is critically important.
Right. And you can't do that without acknowledging what you need to repent for.
Right.
And somehow or other, I guess I can understand. I don't really understand. I find so difficult to understand why people can't acknowledge that we haven't been some kind of perfect society all along. We haven't been. And why is that detrimental to acknowledge that and see how we moved on from it or how we need to move on from it? It just boggles my mind why people can't be open to that. There's no downside to it. There's only an upside.
Yeah, it's very embedded, very deeply embedded. But truth, I think that there's a problem with truth right now with people don't want to, a lot of leaders are, there's so much, dishonesty and corruption and all that, but at least it's getting, unfortunately, revealed. Well, fortunately, and terrible to witness, but yeah, it's time.
Next week, we'll take a break from Tisby's book to discuss the colonization of the New World, and particularly the colonization or the missionary activity in California. So I'll send out a link to readings